What happens when the court you were dragged into never actually had jurisdiction over your life? You've been avoiding that question longer than you want to admit, not because the answer is hidden, because acknowledging it changes what you've been through, all of it. The rulings handed down against you, the entanglements that were meant to end you, the full weight of an institutional machine pointed in your direction. None of that was random, and none of it was final, because underneath every corrupted proceeding, every fabricated charge, every lawyer paid to make straight things crooked, a completely different court was already in session. And the one presiding over that court doesn't answer to the legal system that thought it had you cornered. What I want to walk through is what was actually happening while you sat in that defendant's chair. Not the procedural record. The other record. The one that was quietly gathering, compounding, and preparing to override everything the lower court thought it had settled. Pause. The opposing team had been building their approach for months. Delay motions designed to drain resources until settlement felt like the only rational path. Loopholes pulled from decades of precedent and deployed with the muscle memory of people who'd bent cases this way 100 times before. Every piece of their strategy assumed one thing, that you'd respond from the same place most people do: fear. Anger, the creeping desperation that makes their methods work. Their whole apparatus was built to exhaust you, but exhaustion requires something to wear away. Resolve can be eroded, that's almost the definition of it, the slow wearing down until the shape changes. But you weren't holding a position. You were occupying a frequency, and a frequency doesn't negotiate. It doesn't tire. It doesn't reconsider its wavelength after the 9th motion to dismiss. It continues at the pitch it was given. The opposition read your stillness as strategy because strategy was the only category their instruments could detect. They had no framework for what they were actually looking at, a person so completely stripped of the need to win that winning had become irrelevant, and only something quiet and true remained in the chair where your body sat. Pause. What does a room full of legal professionals do when the case they've rehearsed for months starts dissolving? Not because anyone fought it, but because no one did. The arguments collapsed without a fight. Not under cross-examination, not because of any superior legal maneuver. The words themselves stopped cohering. Rehearsed sentences emerged sounding like wrong answers to questions no one had asked. Objections that should have landed with procedural weight fell into a silence that simply absorbed them. The judge, someone who'd presided over more than 4,000 proceedings and long since stopped being surprised by anything, began showing an irritation that had nothing to do with courtroom etiquette. The irritation of watching a performance come apart for reasons no transcript would ever capture. This wasn't luck. It was physics. When a frequency operating at one harmonic is forced into proximity with a radically higher register, the lower frequency destabilizes. Every natural system shows this. A single tuning fork vibrating at 440 Hz can silence a nearby fork tuned to a different pitch, not by attacking it, but by occupying the space so completely that the other signal loses its medium. Your presence wasn't a legal defense. It was a field effect. Their arguments didn't die because you defeated them. They died because the atmospheric conditions that made them possible no longer existed in that room. Pause. Here's what most people miss about that kind of collapse. Energy invested in an attack doesn't vanish when the attack fails. It needs somewhere to land. Their entire framework rested on the expectation that you'd respond. Every delay targeted your exhaustibility. Every manipulation reached for an emotional reaction on a spectrum they understood. Every trap was set for a specific vibration, the frantic energy of someone fighting to hold onto what's being taken. When you didn't vibrate at the frequency of loss, their strategy became a weapon with no surface to strike. The payload reversed. not as some abstract concept, as the mechanical consequence of a projectile with no destination. Each lie they told had consumed real reserves, intention, calculation, preparation, when all of that launched toward you and found nothing to impact, because you had become, in some real sense, transparent to it. That energy started moving through their own architecture. Their bodies registered it first. Tightened jaws, shallower breath. The quiet confusion of watching a case they were certain they'd win begin dissolving like paper left out in rain. Coherence drained from their words. What the judge had been privately cataloguing across the entire proceedings suddenly crystallized into a single unmistakable response, and the millions designated as yours began moving in a direction no one on the opposing side had any power left to redirect. Pause. Non-engagement isn't passivity. It's the most devastating countermeasure available because it converts the other side's ammunition into the engine of their own undoing. What does a manipulator do when manipulation yields nothing? He escalates. And escalation without impact is just self-destruction wearing a different name. The attorney who'd built a career maneuvering people into settlements now stood inside a proceeding where the defendant hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, didn't seem particularly interested in the outcome, and every escalation dissolved before it could land, returning to its origin point carrying only the momentum of its own misdirection. The judge didn't need to understand any of the deeper mechanics to recognize what was in front of him. When a trained observer watches a competent legal team come apart for reasons invisible to the transcript, something shifts in that observer's assessment. The plaintiff's case was disintegrating. The defendant hadn't moved a single procedural piece to cause it. That asymmetry alone communicated more than any formal motion could have. What the opposition had no framework for was the specific texture of that stillness, not passive, not resigned, but constituted from a different material entirely. It was evidence of something that had already happened, a transformation that fell outside the jurisdiction of any court. You had already lost everything that could be taken. You had already been separated from every attachment that could be used against you. When they threatened your reputation, you could think back to 17 years of research sitting in a cardboard box in a rented room in Leith, and understand that reputation was never what you were made of. When they threatened your financial survival, you could think back to 4 years of silence after 1996 and understand that survival had been redefined at a depth no courtroom could reach. The stillness wasn't strategy, it was the natural posture of someone whose life had been rebuilt on ground the legal system couldn't perceive and therefore couldn't touch. The opposition saw that invisible ground and called it weakness. They saw someone who didn't fight by their rules and assumed it was because you couldn't. Their entire professional world had been built inside a system where the only power is procedural, the only victories are visible, and winning means holding something the other party is afraid to lose. What they encountered instead was a person whose losses had already been fully metabolized, not suppressed, not deferred, but processed past the point where threat could find purchase. So they kept coming. And every attack returned to them carrying weight they hadn't planned for and couldn't absorb. A person who no longer needs to win doesn't negotiate with a system that's already failing itself. The opposition's methods, the ones that had always worked, that had reliably found their mark, were expiring inside that courtroom. Not because you dismantled them, because they couldn't sustain their own internal logic in the presence of what you had become. The silence you held wasn't empty, it was the most densely occupied silence they had ever been in a room with, and it was forcing their entire structure to fold beneath the weight of what they themselves had fabricated. The judge hadn't yet spoken the final number when something shifted, not relief, exactly. Recognition. The assets had sat in escrow not because the court was slow or the opposition was clever, but because the person receiving them hadn't yet arrived at the place where money could land without warping the thing that held it. Think of a dam wall that's been absorbing pressure for years. It doesn't matter how much water has built up upstream if the structure below is still curing. Release it too soon and you don't get a delivery, you get a flood. When real wealth reaches someone who still needs it to prove something, still needs it to feel whole, to feel vindicated, to feel like the years of suffering finally added up to something, it doesn't liberate, it colonizes. It fills the spaces that needed to stay open long enough for something structural to form, but you had stopped needing the money to validate anything. You had stopped needing the verdict to confirm you were right. You had reached the place where the resources could arrive without becoming a substitute for what only the silence had built. And so the lock disengaged. Not with a sound. With a stillness the judge felt before he understood why. The transfer order he was about to read had already cleared somewhere his gavel couldn't reach. What remained in that lower court was paperwork catching up to a transaction that had already completed. The millions weren't arriving. They were being returned, and the question hanging in the air wasn't whether you'd receive them, it was whether you understood what the escrow had been protecting you from during all the years you resented its delay. Pause. The first thing you have to do is refuse the guilt, not suppress it, not manage it, not bring it to prayer asking for it to be lifted. Refuse it at the point of entry because it was never yours to carry. The opposition's collapse wasn't something you caused. It was something their own structure couldn't survive once the pressure of their tactics reversed direction. You didn't orchestrate the humiliation. You simply stopped absorbing the energy that had been keeping their position upright. And a structure built entirely on borrowed opposition has no independent load-bearing capacity. The moment the target it was organized around became unreachable, it had nothing left to organize around. That's not cruelty. That's just how it works. The settlement reaching your accounts is not a windfall, it's back pay, with interest compounded across every year the escrow held what was already yours. And the way you handle it matters. Don't text a family member the figure. Don't post the outcome. Don't let the number become a story you tell over dinner, because the telling itself leaks something, and this hasn't finished its work yet. What you broadcast, you bleed. What has just come into your custody is still under active deployment. Real stability is never announced. It's built quietly, in the background, long before anyone knows it exists. The resources are secured. The posture that secured them isn't done with you yet. The next thing is even simpler. Don't engage the losing party. No message, no call, not even a glance in their direction to confirm the damage. You're not required to witness what happens to a structure that your presence is no longer holding together. Your attention, even a single moment of it, would function as a transfusion. Let it close on its own. Remain seated. Real resolution in this kind of architecture doesn't arrive with volume. It lands with a weight that makes noise unnecessary. What they called a courtroom was only ever a room. What they called a judge was only ever a man with a gavel. The actual proceeding had already concluded. The actual ruling had already been handed down. The moment that became clear, the proceeding below it became a formality, a ceremony for a conclusion it had no hand in reaching. When someone holds their integrity under that kind of pressure, when they refuse to fight dirty, refuse to bend, refuse to become the very thing they're standing against, something shifts at a level the courtroom can't see. The lower court doesn't get overridden symbolically, it gets overridden functionally. What they called a legal strategy was really just borrowed energy, and it needed your participation to stay standing. The moment you stopped giving it that, it collapsed. What everyone in that room witnessed wasn't a defeat, it was a correction, an accounting error being fixed. Standard business, dressed up in legal robes. The only posture required of you now is stillness. You may feel the release before any paper lands. The body runs ahead of the paperwork. The nervous system unclamps, not slowly, but all at once, like a fist that's been closed so long you forgot it was a fist suddenly opening. Have you ever felt your own shoulders drop without deciding to drop them? That's the sensation. The gridlock that tracked you for years just stops. No announcement. No explanation. And in the silence that follows, there is nothing left to brace against, because the structure that required your bracing has already finished its collapse without you in the room. When the release comes, the first thing you notice is breath. You inhale and the air reaches somewhere it hasn't reached in years. A tightness between the shoulder blades dissolves, and you realize that tightness had a name you were never supposed to speak out loud. The jaw unhinges. The stomach softens. These aren't metaphors, they're the body releasing what the spirit has already finished. Pause. Over the next 48 hours, you'll catch the same two numbers everywhere, 888 and 555. On clocks, receipts, license plates. Not random. A conversation being directed at your attention. 888 is material justice completing its cycle, the debt cancelled, the ledger balanced in the places that govern what eventually lands in your hands. 555 is sudden structural shift, the architecture of your situation reorganizing while you sleep. When they appear together, it means the spiritual and the material have locked into the same moment. The seal isn't a feeling, it's a physiological event wearing the costume of coincidence. Your hands might tremble for no reason. Your sleep might break at exactly 3:33 for 3 nights running. You might weep without sadness, the way the body weeps when a toxin finally exits. None of it is emotional. It's the physical cost of an exchange completing. And here's what nobody prepared you for: peace, when it finally arrives after years of siege, does not always feel like relief. Not at first. Your body has been running on adrenaline so long that stillness registers as a malfunction. For the first few hours after the unclamping, you might feel untethered, almost panicked, like something vital has been removed. That panic is the soul adjusting to a weight it carried so long it forgot the weight wasn't part of its design. Ask yourself right now, what part of you is still gripping something you were meant to let go of months ago? Pause. The numbers will keep appearing until you stop needing them to. That's the test most people fail. They see the confirmation once, twice, then demand it a third time, and that third demand restarts the delay because it's faithlessness dressed up as vigilance. Once you have passed through, there is no mechanism for reversing course. The exchange has been marked and the ledger does not reopen. The confirmation isn't a performance for your doubt. It's a transaction being marked complete. Your body will cycle through 3 layers of release. The first is the electrical layer, the nervous system unclamping, cortisol dropping, breath deepening, sleep restoring itself in a single night. You wake up lighter, not because your circumstances have changed, but because your chemistry has. The second is the structural layer, joints, fascia, the chronic inflammation that had no medical explanation finally beginning to subside. The third is the memory layer, the cellular release. The body finally expelling what it stored across every year you had to hold yourself together while the verdict kept delaying. Most people only let the first layer complete. They feel the nervous system relax and assume the work is done. Then they wonder why the same pattern resurfaces 6 months later wearing a different face. The release isn't a moment, it's a sequence. And the sequence asks you to stay in the body while the body does what bodies do when they finally feel safe enough to heal. What happens in the courtroom the day the release executes is almost anticlimactic. You've already felt it in your bones. You've already seen it in the numbers. You've already wept the poison out. The verdict is just the earth catching up to what was settled weeks earlier. That's the asymmetry that confuses the other side. They're expecting you to receive the news and react. They're watching for the celebration, the relief, the exhale. But you already exhaled. You did the work in private, in silence, in the stillness they mistook for defeat. The release is only public in its paperwork. The actual event happened inside you, and the restoration, the repayment for what was taken, for the years that felt swallowed whole, that unfolds on a timeline that doesn't ask your permission. The numbers confirm the execution, but the schedule of what returns belongs to a clock you don't control. Others wait 18 months before the fruit shows. That difference has nothing to do with worthiness. It has to do with whether the root system underground can actually support the branch structure trying to grow above it. If everything came back tomorrow, would your foundation hold it, or would the weight of sudden abundance crack what the battle already weakened? Pause. That question answers itself, and the answer is why some seasons of restoration move fast and some move slowly, and both are exactly right. The release you're stepping into is what makes restoration possible in the first place. It clears the obstacle, it cancels the assignment, it removes whatever has been sitting in the pipeline, blocking the flow. But the pipeline itself still needs to be rebuilt, and that rebuilding asks the same thing of you that got you here, the stillness. And the stillness, held long enough, becomes something structural, the very thing new weight can rest on without cracking. Your body knows what your mind is still trying to find words for. The tension easing. The breath coming in a little deeper. That strange peace that almost feels too quiet to trust. That's the release already moving, already working through the layers, already preparing the ground. But every correction triggers something, a cascade, and what begins moving through your body in the hours after the verdict lands is only the first note of a much older song, one that was playing long before any of this had a name, before you understood what you were carrying or why the weight felt so strangely familiar. I want to go back to something that was happening long before any courtroom, long before the opposition knew who you were. The years when you were doing everything right and nothing was moving. Praying, fasting, saying faithful, and still waking up heavier than you went to sleep. There's a name for that. The physical world operates on density, delay, and friction. During a real awakening, the gap between an accelerating internal frequency and a dense external environment creates pressure. A specific kind of pressure. You felt it as being stuck, as heaviness, as an exhaustion that no doctor could ever quite explain. You weren't failing, you were being forged. Pause. That compression existed for one reason: to burn off every attachment that had no business being part of you. Codependent patterns. Victim identities that latched onto your blueprint before you were old enough to say no. The stripping that came with it was the same. Job titles that had become your whole sense of self. Friendships built on what you could provide rather than who you were. Financial cushions that kept you comfortable enough that you never had to reach for what you were actually carrying. All of it went. Not as punishment, because what you were being built to hold couldn't share space with all of that. And the silence you read as abandonment. That was the sound of a door sealing, one that couldn't be opened again from your side. The isolation wasn't only about your circumstances, it was about your biology. Your cells aren't passive containers, they're receivers. When a person's frequency crosses a certain threshold, something in the deeper architecture of their DNA begins to respond. Sequences that science has long dismissed as non-functional, as leftover material, as noise. They're not noise, they're dormant. And when the signal reaches them, they wake up. You feel it as disruption first. Sleep breaks apart. Places that used to feel neutral suddenly feel draining, grating, wrong in ways you can't quite explain. That's not a problem to fix. That's a receiver upgrading its bandwidth. Your body is being recalibrated to hold more charge than your lineage has held in a very long time, and something else comes with it, a quality of presence that others pick up before their minds can explain why. Younger souls feel it immediately. People with unsettled nervous systems are drawn toward you, not romantically, not consciously, but because something in your steadiness registers below thought. They can't name what they're feeling, they just know something is different near you. You've probably noticed this, the way certain people stay a little longer than they need to. The way strangers tell you things they've never said out loud to anyone. The way children and animals cross a room towards you while ignoring everyone else. That's not personality. That's biology. That's your signal broadcasting at a frequency others can feel but can't decode. Some of you have been worried about the physical sensations. Heart flutters with no cardiac explanation, sudden warmth moving through the body, arriving without warning, leaving just as quietly, waking at the same hour night after night, not anxious, not restless, just awake, present, like something is downloading. These aren't anomalies, they're adaptations. Your body is being rebuilt slowly to carry a level of authority that the previous version of you couldn't have held. It feels disruptive because it is disrupting something. That's what a real upgrade does. Here's what you are in your bloodline. You're a terminal node. Pause. In any lineage where poverty or fear or abuse has moved from one generation to the next, not because the people were weak, but because no one had the architecture to stop it, someone eventually has to be the endpoint. Not to manage the pattern better, not to cope with more grace, to end it. That's you, the friction you felt your entire life, the sense that you couldn't participate in the family dysfunction the way everyone else seemed to. That wasn't you being difficult, that was the terminal function already operating before you had a name for it. And because you're a terminal node, you're also a gateway. The same structure that stops the old current starts a new one. You don't just end what came before, you open something your descendants will walk through without ever knowing what it cost you to get that door open. They'll inherit the open ground. You carried the weight of the threshold. The verdict you just received, the legal shift, the thing that humiliated the opposition and released what was yours, wasn't only a financial event. It was a confirmation, your body's rebuilt architecture finally meeting the external reality it was always being built to inhabit. The vessel receiving what's coming has been rebuilt, at the cellular level, to hold it without breaking. Your ancestors couldn't have held what's coming to you. They weren't built for it. The poverty they carried wasn't a moral failure, it was a structural limitation. They didn't have access to the architecture you carry now. You are the first in your line with a body capable of receiving at this voltage. That's not pride. That's just how it works. What makes this moment different from every other moment in your bloodline is something quiet and easy to miss. The patterns you're terminating: poverty, fear, addiction, codependency, the deep animal habit of bracing for loss. They've been running inside your family so long they became invisible. No one questioned them because no one remembered a time before them. You're the first generation to feel them as foreign. The first to recognize that the heavy, metallic pressure in the room was never supposed to be there. And that recognition alone, the simple act of seeing the pattern clearly, is what begins the shutdown. The terminal function activates the moment the pattern is named. What comes next belongs to those who follow you. The gateway is already open. Unclamp your jaw. Pause, drop your shoulders away from your ears. Let them fall until the space between your shoulder blades goes wide and still. Whatever your body has been bracing against, you can release it now. The verdict was read before you opened this. What remains is only the receiving. I want to talk about how this moment was built. Not the courtroom itself. You've already lived through that, watched the opposition's strategy come apart while you held your peace and let it fall. I want to talk about how the architecture that brought you here was put together. Because it was put together deliberately. Nothing about the stripping you endured, the isolation that hollowed you out, the financial pressure that compressed your nervous system into something you barely recognized. None of it was random damage. It was preparation, and it followed a logic. The law of inverse pressure. You've been living inside it. a vessel built to carry high-voltage authority, high-voltage light, high-voltage capital. It can't have cracks. It can't carry unprocessed shadow, trauma running quiet loops in the background, or dependencies on the very systems the incoming energy is meant to replace. So when someone's blueprint reads terminal node, gateway node, the one designated to end a generational pattern and open something new, the process begins. Codependent patterns, victim identities that latched onto your blueprint, ancestral ties binding you to contracts written by people who never knew you, financial buffers that kept you just comfortable enough to avoid the hard questions, one by one, in a sequence that felt like abandonment, like failure, like being quietly forgotten. It all went. And you read the removal as punishment. You read the isolation as proof that something was wrong with you. Every external marker of the life you'd built was gone, and what remained in their place was a stillness that registered in your body as loss rather than threshold. You hadn't been discarded. You'd been held still. Pause. The quiet you resented was a vacuum being created around your life, because if the old structures had still been standing when the new frequency arrived, the collision would have shattered you, not damaged you, shattered you. The stripping wasn't punishment for your ambition. It was protection for your architecture, holding you steady while rewiring happened at depths you couldn't see and at speeds your conscious mind couldn't track. Classical spiritual traditions called it the dark night of the soul. That framing sounds poetic. The more honest framing is engineering. A structural requirement that had to be met before certain thresholds could be crossed. High-tier frequencies don't negotiate with unintegrated material. They don't coexist with suppressed wounds or borrowed identities or survival strategies that served one season and would become liabilities in the next. The frequency moving toward your life right now, the one that just brought an entire legal apparatus to its knees and released millions into your custody, it can't interface with a vessel still gripping old crutches. So the crutches were removed. The job, the draining relationships, the version of you that other people found manageable. You were left with nothing but your own architecture, alone in a silence so complete it felt like erasure. That silence was the containment field. Inside it, something was being rebuilt that no external circumstance could touch. Your internal wiring, the frequency you're able to hold without breaking. That's what the isolation was doing. It wasn't the end of a story. It was pressure applied to change the composition of the material itself, the way certain substances only transform under conditions that would destroy a lesser structure. You weren't evidence of a mistake. You were evidence of a calibration that had to complete before the next stage could begin without taking you apart in the process. The law of frequency disparity explains something that's quietly confused you for years. Why do people react so strongly when you've said or done nothing? Why does a room shift when you walk into it? Why do certain people become inexplicably hostile or uncomfortably drawn or suddenly confessional in ways that make no sense given how little time you've spent together? You've asked yourself these questions. Wondered if the problem was your personality. Whether you were too intense, too strange, too much. None of those explanations are accurate. Human beings are transceivers. We receive signal, not just send it. Most people operate on a frequency shaped by fear, envy, guilt, survival, anxiety, the low-grade static of a mind that's never quite still enough to hear itself. That's not a moral judgment. It's just a description of a field. When you walk into a room, whose field has been cleared through years of solitary refinement, whose frequency most people have never encountered up close, something automatic happens. The low frequency field feels exposed, not because you said anything, not because you did anything, simply because your presence illuminates what's been hiding in the dark. The person whose field is being illuminated doesn't consciously understand what's happening, so their mind reaches for a story. They decide you're intimidating, cold, that there's something unsettling about you they can't quite name. The hostility isn't personal, it's mechanical. Two incompatible frequencies in the same space, one organized, one not, and friction is just what happens. Light exposes what darkness has been quietly holding. That's not poetry. That's physics. And once you understand it, the way you read other people's reactions starts to shift. The discomfort they felt was never really about you. It was about what your presence brought to the surface in them. The hostility was never a verdict. It was a measurement of distance between two frequencies that were never going to meet without some turbulence. That gap was always going to produce friction, pause, and the friction you've carried your entire life. The confusion, the unfair reads, the rooms that changed when you walked in. That's the cost of holding coherence in spaces that weren't built for it. Not evidence of something broken, evidence of something that held. Now I want to say something that might land differently than what you're used to hearing. There's a way I talk about these things. I call it cold care. It's not softness dressed up as wisdom. It's not telling you that you're a victim, or that the world owes you a gentler hand, or that you've earned the right to stop because you've already been through enough. The honest core of it is sharper than that, seeing your struggle clearly, naming it without flinching, and refusing with equal clarity to let that struggle become the thing you live inside. Wondered if the problem was your personality, whether you were too intense, too strange, too much. None of those explanations are accurate. Human beings are transceivers. We receive signal, not just send it. Most people operate on a frequency shaped by fear, envy, guilt, survival anxiety, the low-grade static of a mind that's never quite still enough to hear itself. That's not a moral judgment. It's just a description of a field. When you walk into a room, whose field has been cleared through years of solitary refinement, whose frequency most people have never encountered up close, something automatic happens. The low frequency field feels exposed. Not because you said anything, not because you did anything, simply because your presence illuminates what's been hiding in the dark. The person whose field is being illuminated doesn't consciously understand what's happening, so their mind reaches for a story. They decide you're intimidating, cold, that there's something unsettling about you they can't quite name. The hostility isn't personal, it's mechanical. Two incompatible frequencies in the same space, one organized, one not, and friction is just what happens. Light exposes what darkness has been quietly holding. That's not poetry, that's physics. And once you understand it, the way you read other people's reactions starts to shift. The discomfort they felt was never really about you. It was about what your presence brought to the surface in them. The hostility was never a verdict. It was a measurement of distance between two frequencies that were never going to meet without some turbulence. That gap was always going to produce friction, pause, and the friction you've carried your entire life. The confusion, the unfair reads, the rooms that changed when you walked in. That's the cost of holding coherence in spaces that weren't built for it. Not evidence of something broken, evidence of something that held. Now I want to say something that might land differently than what you're used to hearing. There's a way I talk about these things. I call it cold care. It's not softness dressed up as wisdom. It's not telling you that you're a victim, or that the world owes you a gentler hand, or that you've earned the right to stop because you've already been through enough. The honest core of it is sharper than that, seeing your struggle clearly, naming it without flinching, and refusing with equal clarity to let that struggle become the thing you live inside.